I find graduates coming through now are very much more holistic in their approach, which is very good to see. And lifestyle medicine, various, you can call it integrative, which is really my approach because I do lifestyle. I incorporate medicinal cannabis as part of that, but I help people with weight loss. I can incorporate medicinal cannabis. If, say, somebody's got bad anxiety and they need medicinal cannabis for that, but then we can get a good effect on diabetes as well, for example, particularly type 2 diabetes. So it's a lovely blend. And I treat medicinal cannabis as part of my armamentarium, a very useful one. But I'm never slow to tell people if I think there's a better alternative for them when they approach me about medicinal cannabis.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Harmonia Podcast. We are joined here today by the lovely Dr. Geoff Cutter from Australia. Dr. Geoff is going to be speaking to us about using your medication as part of your healthcare treatment. But before we go into that, let me just hand over to Dr. Cutter to do a more formal introduction. Hi, Dr. Cutter.
Hi, Berta. Lovely to see you again. I've been a full-time medicinal cannabis and integrative health practitioner in Australia for 4 years. I've always had a holistic approach to medicine anyway, because to me that's common sense. This business of anatomical divisions and somebody becoming a head or a migraine or a back pain, which is all too common. So quite early in my career, I decided that holistic was the way to go. It gets a little bit misused as a phrase, but yeah, caring for the whole person, of which medicinal cannabis has become a very useful tool.
No, thank you so much for joining us today. And also, I know you say that it's common sense, but you would be very, very shocked at how generally in healthcare, it's a holistic approach is not necessarily practiced. What you generally tend to find is a person is either given a prescription, and once that prescription is effective, they are left without any review, without any consultation. And there have been oftentimes, and I feel that I'm not quite sure how it works in Australia, but definitely I can say at the NHS, they treat just the condition and that's it. They don't necessarily look at the person as a whole and how that condition has actually impacted their day to day life. And unfortunately, this is sort of like a sad hole we've dug ourselves into. And with the medical cannabis sector, I am very vocal about not digging the same hole for ourselves in that respect. And I suppose that's where you come into it, in terms of how you use medical cannabis as a part of somebody's care and not the be all and end all. So I'm going to zip my mouth now and hand over to you so that you can talk about some of the amazing work that you do.
Don't do that, Berta. I could listen to you all night. Maybe I should rephrase it. I should point out I'm in Australia, so it's the evening. Um, Thank you. Thank you. Now, what's a good starting point? Cannabis is medicine. There's still a lot of confusion, and quite a good deal of that confusion arises out of what the Americans like to call adult use, what we call recreational, but either way illegal or illicitly. There's still a lot of grey area and confusion about the role of cannabis in our lives. So, from the medical perspective, cannabis is medicine, and it's a darn good one too. It's got a wonderful variety of properties that we can bring to bear frequently on medical issues that haven't previously been treatable or have been subtreated because we had no other options. There are many, many reasons that surround this. The stigma that continues is just part of the hangover from, well, the Reagan years, and cannabis as a gateway drug, all of those sort of things. And we won't go into the politics of that, but it's interesting. And so we have the stigma, we have the devil's lettuce, one of my favorite phrases that gets thrown around.
I've never heard of that before. The devil's lettuce. Oh, I'm using that.
Oh yes, you talk to any very certainly in the Bible Belt in America. That's how cannabis is regarded. That's the name for it. Don't go near the devil's lettuce.
Oh, that is a new one. I have stolen that phrase.
Please do. You're most welcome to it. So, for example, as far as we can estimate, because it's illegal, because it's illicit, we don't have figures, but the probable value of illicit, the green market, they often call it in Australia, is around $4 to $6 billion Australian per year. To put that in context, the medicinal cannabis market is probably around the order of 200 million. So you can see where the vast majority of people are still getting their cannabis. And that's something which will evolve over time. Like many countries, Australia is considering legalizing what is currently the illegal market, but it's going to be tough to do, as others have found. And am I in favour? Well, actually, perhaps surprisingly, I'm not enormously, because you mentioned before having medical input and guidance about what the best product is to be using. And medicinal cannabis, as you probably know, is made to very stringent and to pharmaceutical standards. With the GMP certification and so on, it's squeaky clean. You can get a certificate of analysis. I know as a prescriber what I'm prescribing. And it does seem, looking at the Canadian experience, that was all going along very nicely. They legalized their medicinal use first, but when they then legalized recreational, the medicinal cannabis side of the story stumbled severely and is still stumbling, because people said, well, why should I bugger about going to a doctor? We're allowed to say that in Australia. Why should I waste my time going to a doctor and paying fees? In Canada, perhaps, I don't actually know. They have a state health system as well. When I can just, get it easily at the local store or whatever. And you might say, well, yes, if for recreational use, there's not a problem. But if you're looking at medicinal use, that becomes another matter. And I don't think anybody's really satisfactorily worked out how to do that. Even in Australia, all the proposals are pretty much hinged, much like Colorado, on tax income. And therefore, how do you procure that, and how do you police it, and so on? And the question that never seems to be answered, and occurs to me, is, well, why are all these people who are selling illegally suddenly going to become law-abiding citizens and report to the government and tell them how much they're producing and pay their taxes? Human beings are not known for being keen to pay taxes. So I have a lot of doubts about, that aspect of it. Anyway, let's get back to holistic medicine, treating the person as a whole. That's all it means, which is kind of blindingly obvious, one might expect. And yet I know we agree that, sadly, it's not the way medicine is taught in medical school, which is where the problems start. You divide it up, you do 10 weeks of this speciality and 10 weeks of that speciality. And so you sort of get an approach, you're inculcated with an approach that is almost anatomical. And even worse, in aged care, I've heard of people referring to humans, by their condition. Oh yes, that's Mrs. Brown. She's the migraine. Oh yes, that's Mr. Smith. He's the back pain. Terrible, dehumanizing.
Well, sadly, I thank you. It happens here too.
Yeah, it happens all over the world. I think. Um, why? What can we do about it? It is changing slowly. I find graduates coming through now are very much more holistic in their approach, which is very good to see. Um, and lifestyle medicine, various, you know, you can call it integrative, which is really my approach because I do lifestyle. I incorporate medicinal cannabis as part of that, but I help people with weight loss. I can incorporate medicinal cannabis. If, say, somebody's got bad anxiety and they need medicinal cannabis for that, but then we can get a good effect on diabetes as well, for example, particularly type 2 diabetes. So it's a lovely blend, and I treat medicinal cannabis as part of my armamentarium, a very useful one. But I'm never slow to tell people if I think there's a better alternative for them when they approach me about medicinal cannabis. Um, I think that's very important. There's quite a few, it's not uncommon for people to get so enthusiastic about medicinal cannabis that they don't look at alternatives. So, in simple terms, for example, I make good use of PEA, which is wonderful anti inflammatory stuff without any of the side effects of anti inflammatories, and is in fact about two or three back up the metabolic pathway of the endocannabinoids, as you probably know, but your listeners may not. So, and by the way, you can buy PEA over the counter unrestricted, which is wonderful. Beta caryophyllene, a terpene, which is found not just in cannabis, but in black pepper, in cinnamon, I think, basil, coriander, all over the place, hops, even. When you drink your beer, you're ingesting some beta caryophyllene. That's not an excuse to use it as a pain reliever, but I will recommend terpenes and terpene mixtures, which we have available here. I'm not sure if you do in the UK, but they're generally classed as a foodstuff. Well, they should be. They're classed as foodstuff here, or herbal, so they're unrestricted, and you can buy very useful mixtures that will improve your focus, for example, if you have a problem with focus, which many of us do. Um, they can wake you up, they can stimulate you, they can damp you down, but none of them have got anything to do with cannabis, and they're all completely legal. It's just the natural properties of various terpenes. Terpenes are, for your viewers, terpenes are substances that are found in every plant on earth, including the cannabis plant. And their role is either to attract pollinators. So, for example, the lovely smell of citrus blossom, or you may not be familiar with that so much. Yeah, you get orange blossom, don't you, in the UK? Lavender is a good example. The smell of lavender is down to a terpene called limonene. So they either have a role of attracting pollinators or they have a defensive role for the plant by making it smell bad or taste bad. And we find them, sure enough, in cannabis, being a plant. But in cannabis, rather uniquely, they do play a role in the results or the effects they have on when you ingest them. So my approach when somebody comes to me about medicinal cannabis is I'm obliged to make sure they're eligible under the government criteria, but they're pretty broad criteria. So almost everybody is eligible, which is, I think, a little different from the United Kingdom, probably. Um, and then I establish why they're looking for or why they're looking towards medicinal cannabis, um, which goes hand in hand often with the criteria. And then I establish with them what it is what problems they're seeking to resolve, and then I ask them to prioritize those as well, because there are often four or five things at the same time. You know, I have anxiety, chronic low back pain, poor sleep because of the back pain, etc. So we need to know what matters to you most, what's going to make the biggest difference to your life, and get you jumping through hoops again if that's what you want to be doing. So prioritizing, um, and I tell them that in advance so that they can go away and have a think about it. And then when we get back together again, we readdress that. They tell me what is most important. There are sometimes situations where we can't treat everything with medicinal cannabis or anything else, sadly. But the wonderful thing about medicinal cannabis is it's hugely broad spectrum of effects. It's anti-inflammatory, it's antioxidant, it's antibiotic, it's antiviral. Now, did you know that people who use cannabis regularly had a far lower incidence of severe COVID, and virtually, I don't think any of them have been reported as having long COVID. And we now know that there is a role for medicinal cannabis in long COVID, derived from its antiviral sort of properties. So it's antifungal. It's a wonderful antifungal. So we could go on and on. It has lots of very useful neurological effects. You can treat neuropathies. Diabetic neuropathy can be treated, for example. Trigeminal neuralgias and other neuralgias respond very well, which they don't to anything else. All we've ever had really for all of these things, and many of the big family called autoimmune diseases or disorders, we've treated them with steroids, and that's all we've had. And now we've got a good crack at. I've had some great results with some people who've had SLE, for example, systemic lupus. So it's almost the sky's the limit. And it's more a question as a prescriber of restraining oneself a little, in fact, and not getting too excited about it, but still seeking to target appropriately, and thereby create a much better quality of life for the person I'm talking to.
No, that sounds amazing that you're taking all of these things into consideration. Like you did say, when somebody, well, okay, as a person with a chronic illness, I can tell you that it impacts so many areas. So, like you said, I can't sleep because of the pain. So, I'll have medication at night, and that will help me get to sleep. But as soon as the medication wears out of my system, I'm then woken up by the pain. And so I've got insomnia as a result. And so these are sort of the things that we really do need to look at. And I agree with you. Looking at the common denominator will always help in terms of eliminating, I guess, the excess or the rest. But how, sort of, what recommendations would you have for people when, and I suppose I'm trying to figure out how I'm trying to explain this. Give me 2 seconds. So, when you have I like to just say chronic illness because, when it comes to mental health and when it comes to physical health, I don't really see a difference. All I see is a person whose quality of life has been sort of stripped from them. And because people tend to forget that whether it's mental or physical, there's so many limitations that are on you as a result. And so, addressing, I suppose, the one problem doesn't necessarily help with other problems. So, to give an example, if you have somebody who has got anxiety, and as a result of their anxiety has now is now housebound, so they've developed agoraphobia, which I have been through before, due to my physical health more. However, that person, once you give them the anti-anxiety medication, it's not actually going to support them in leaving the house, especially if they have been indoors for about a whole year. So, how do you address all of the backlash as a result of just this one condition? Am I making any sense? Because my brain is over here racing. So, I'm like, okay, yeah.
You're making perfect sense, and it's a very good question. I talk to my patients. That may sound obvious, but in fact, so many people tell me, patients tell me. I actually don't call my patients patients in the cannabis arena. I call them clients. And they will tell me that they've had that experience with GPs and other doctors. They say they stare at the computer screen while I'm talking. I don't even know if they're properly listening to me. They're just typing away, and then they sort of print a script and hand it to me and say, "There you go, that's it," sort of thing. I actually enjoy talking to my patients. There's a lot of them almost become family. In fact, I know where they're going on holiday, etc. But to answer your question, I I I I encourage them verbally. So, um, and that's where having an idea from their point of view about what the issue is. So I'll give you an example that comes to mind. A chap who was in his 30s who was happily married, 2 kids, but he had a long-term anxiety problem, probably started um, in his teens. And of course, we now really do realize, which is relatively new, about childhood trauma. And childhood trauma doesn't have to mean physical abuse, sexual abuse, the things we might first think of. It can be, it can actually unexpectedly, for example, I had a client recently who they were a single child and they had very loving parents and a wonderful childhood in, every way that one could think of, except that dad, and to a lesser extent mum, had very, very high expectations of what they should achieve at school, and that they would naturally go to university and they would probably become a doctor or a lawyer. And so this client had been under extreme pressure from that point of view as a child to always come top of the class. And they manifested that a little bit later in life, in their early adulthood, as severe anxiety and imposter syndrome and all of those things that go as part of the anxiety spectrum. The very excellent news is, and I want to, if I may dispel a myth here, you absolutely do not need THC to treat anxiety. In fact, for quite a large number of people, it makes it worse. So I always put my patients with social anxiety or any other type of anxiety, this is all the psychiatrists at play. They like to categorize things. With pure CBD and plenty of terpenes. And sometimes the effect is remarkably swift. It's so swift, I catch myself thinking, I wonder if there was a little bit of placebo in that somewhere. But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. If they're getting better, it doesn't matter. It's said up to 40% of results from any pharmaceutical preparation are probably placebo. So it's a well-recognized phenomenon, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that they're feeling better. And this person, we did a review consultation, and I said, "So how's it going, George?" And he said, "Well, no, you know what, Doc? It was bloody amazing." He said, "My wife said to me, we don't go out together because I'm too nervous. But she said, I'm going to a party on Saturday night. Why don't you come with me?" And I was feeling quite a lot improved, so I did. And he said, I found myself in this room talking to people. And he said, I've never done that. And I was moving around the room, chatting to complete strangers. Never been able to do that before. So I tell you what, mate, he said, this cannabis stuff's bloody marvellous. A nice result very quickly. I've had as little as 3 days. I find that a little hard to believe, and that was manifested by a lady who said, "Oh, guess what, doctor? She actually started her medicinal cannabis around about the 21st of December." And she did her usual phone calls on Christmas Day. And she said, person after person said to me, "Wow, you're sounding so good. This is like the old you. What's happened? What's changed? Are you in love or what's going on?" I should add she was happily married. And it appeared that the CBD had kicked in that fast. And she hadn't even noticed herself. It took her friends and relatives to say, "Wow, you're a different person." Now, we know that these are, these are small examples. This is not to be expected. We've said there's a spectrum of results from medicinal cannabis, ranging from considerable improvement, hopefully, always at the very least, through to complete resolution of the problem in hand, and then at the end of that, just a small number of people who don't seem to react to it for reasons we're uncertain about, but probably are genetically based. But it is important to have a realistic expectation if you embark on a course of medicinal cannabis about how much it might do for you, um, and also give it a chance. The other thing is we're in a hurry. We're brought up, aren't we, to take a pill, you know, and we expect that pill to kick in and work within half an hour. And in fact, the pharmaceutical industry knows that that's how preparations have got to work. And we can't do anything about that with cannabis, really. There's very few variables, especially if we want to stick to the natural plant as far as possible, which I do, and I'm a great believer in whole plants. And I'm very unhappy that the Australian driving laws prevent me from widely prescribing um, whole plant and whole full spectrum, including THC and other words. But that's a hindrance, certainly. It is a hindrance, and especially as we know, for example, that neuropathies and neuralgias and things like muscle spasms in multiple sclerosis actually do need THC to give a result. CBD alone does not work. So we can only do what we can do.
No, but it sounds like, first of all, you're doing some amazing work. I mean, I know you just said something earlier, so I'm gonna just dissect a few things because you said a lot of amazing stuff, but I only want to focus on two things. The first thing actually I want to focus on is I think that a lot of the times, and I think I have discussed it with someone here on the podcast before, people assume that THC means effective medication, when in reality, different conditions require a different part of the plant in order to treat you. So I am somebody who has 38 symptoms, and I like a full spectrum approach because with full spectrum, depending on what symptoms arise, some symptoms only CBD helps. If I even try to have something that's more THC, it doesn't actually work for that symptom. Whereas other ones, I would have to get an indica strain or a sativa strain or sometimes a higher CBD or lower CBD. It just really depends on what symptoms manifest. And it's so important for people to understand that you don't need THC. Like don't get me wrong, if I am in severe pain and I'm talking about 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 10 pain, I need THC. Nothing else will do. However, if I'm feeling like I'm really swollen and I've got a lot of inflammation, THC doesn't really do much for me. CBD, however, works wonders for that. So it's really important for people to understand that, especially cannabis naive patients, because a lot of them would think that, for anxiety, that we're just going to go there and be like, right, here you go, 23% THC, enjoy. No, we wouldn't do that. So yeah, I just thank you for flagging that because it's just something I really, really want to highlight. And then the second thing that I want to highlight is that I love your approach in terms of communication. And like you said yourself, you would think that it's common sense, but unfortunately, it's something that isn't done a lot. People just don't listen to their patients. This is something that even in the UK stretches as far as the social care sector, because I do work in the social care sector, and a lot of the patients that I see, my background, sorry, is mental health and substance misuse, and a lot of the patients that I see that I'm working with in children and families, they will often tell me that they have seen, they have been through the works for 12 years and, have not really gotten much mental health support because no one listened to them. And listening and just communication in general, people do not realize it's already, you're allowing that person to process certain emotions just by letting them talk about it. without going too much into talking therapies, but if you think about it, like, back, during Freud's time, you had the World War I, you had all these people come back with shell shock, and back then they would do electric convulsive therapy and all sorts, to help manage their mental health. And then Freud comes along and it's like, have you tried talking to them? And everyone just thought that this was such a crazy concept. What do you mean talking to them? And that's how basically the foundation of therapy, they started speaking. There's so much more involved. Therapists, don't start yelling at me, okay? I am just paraphrasing here. But that is essentially the basis of it. People started realizing the importance of just talking about something. That in itself supports in so many ways. And it sounds like your patient, you listen to them, and then you advise based on the information that you know. And it's something that I would love every single doctor in the globe to do. So I just wanted to flag those 2 points. Sorry.
No, thank you very much indeed. Look, as you say, types of therapy, cognitive behavioral, and so on. There's quite a few of them. Um, I'm very proud. I must say, actually, I probably didn't have any more knowledge or understanding of mental health issues when I started doing cannabis, in spite of a long, many years in general practice. And I have to say that I have seen and handled far more mental health issues through medicinal cannabis than I ever did in general practice. But I'm pleased to report that I get referrals from psychologists who have tried everything in their repertoire. And, for some people, particularly on the anxiety spectrum and so on, I've got some very interesting cases. There's what we used to call multiple personality. It's now DID. That was more to do with anxiety, and but that also came out as DID normally does come out of horrendous childhood trauma. Yeah, but we helped. I helped her. We improved her life quite considerably. Um, I see. In fact, funnily enough, I have a self-elected role as a cannabis advocate, and particularly amongst my colleagues. And I stick my neck out, and I often get shot down, but that's okay. I'm a big boy, and I can cope with that. I had a fairly, what's the word, politely heated discussion with I suppose it means your reputation spreading, with a French psychologist outside Paris somewhere on LinkedIn, who told me I was essentially, didn't know what I was talking about as regards medicinal cannabis in the mental health space. To be fair, France has only just legalized medicinal cannabis and has not legalized flower, which doesn't really matter in the mental health system. But I suddenly thought I was getting a bit irritated with him, and I said, no, actually, be fair to the chap. He's got no experience of it. He can't, because it's been illegal. So he actually needs education, as we all do. But tomorrow morning, I'm talking to a specialist, I'll have to say, somewhere in Australia, to be discreet. But he's invited me to have a chat, and he's head of a department. And I'm very pleased about that. And I hope that we can take that places, maybe even get some education for his whole department. It's a big hospital somewhere. So you chisel away, as you well know. As you well know, we're chiseling away right now doing this podcast.
Exactly. But no, thank you so much for joining us on here today. I just have one very quick question just to sort of like bring this to, I suppose, an end. In terms of, I suppose my thing is mostly for cannabis naive patients because they would generally be the ones that are very hesitant to get on a prescription. But at the same time, I just hate the idea of somebody out there suffering when there is a medication that could help them, but they are too scared to try it. What would your sort of general feedback be for those particular cohorts of patients?
Bearing in mind that I'm not working in general practice, I don't see many people in that situation, because by the time they get to talk to me, they've already made the decision, or 95%, you know, they just want to double check that there's nothing they haven't heard, and they want to hear it from. So it will be different if you're in general practice. I think again, it all gets down to educating. I mean, it's one of the sadnesses actually is that it's such a convoluted and complex system. Cannabis is just amazing. So, on the one hand, people oversimplify it or think it's just so incredibly easy you don't need to do any training at all. Because how hard can it be, right? You've either got CBD or THC or 50-50 of each. And that's it, isn't it? I mean, that's cannabis. And you'd be astonished how many people are working in clinics on that basis. They've got no awareness, no knowledge of fine tuning. Let's just summarize the complexity of the plant as we finish by reminding people that the cannabis plant has over 6,000 identified individual chemicals, of which around 500 are cannabinoids. So CBD is just one, THC is number two. There's another 498 out there, and some of them have only just been identified. Many of them are present in tiny quantities, but that does not mean that they're not important. Then you've got your terpenes. You've got 70 of those in cannabis. It's going up almost by the week. They keep identifying new terpenes. And then we've got flavonoids, and we haven't even touched on those. Those are the big three active groups of chemicals in cannabis. So it makes perfect sense that if you could take all of those 6,000 chemicals in one hit in some fashion, what we call whole plant, it's much more likely to be effective than going to great pains to extract one molecule or one type of chemical like CBD. And that's where we started from. And it's still the norm in the medicinal cannabis marketplace and products. And I don't say it's bad at all, because it does gives people like me, excuse me, the opportunity to fine tune a little. But you have to say, because of the famous entourage effect, and again, for your naive viewers, entourage is a French word, in fact, which means loosely togetherness. What it means is that the result is greater, the sum is greater than the parts. So if you take CBD and THC together they will have a bigger effect than either would on their own. Now, that's a very fundamental part of cannabis medicine. Now, multiply that out loosely in your head. Just imagine that sort of interlinkage occurring with all of those chemicals in the cannabis plant. And then you can see that your best bet ultimately has to be whole plant, doesn't it? Because we can't say, we don't know which ones are not important. And let's face it, if you believe in evolution, as I do, they wouldn't be there still if they weren't important.
And that is a brilliant point to end it on. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Dr. Cutter. For anybody that is interested in some of the work that he does, his links will be in the description section of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.